Our next speakers are Margot Fink and Sam Litt from the JCCV's Youth Advisory Group, known as J, Jewish or Diverse and Equal.
Hi everyone, I'm Margot. I use she, her pronouns.
Sam, they, them pronouns.
I guess a quick thing before we get started on why we're saying our pronouns. For those who aren't familiar, pronouns are words like she, her, he. Some people even use they or ze as gender neutral options. But basically, we're bringing it up because sometimes people won't use the language you expect, particularly trans and gender diverse. People may not necessarily use the pronoun you would expect at first glance. So it's important to be open to that. And I guess the key thing is just go with whatever they say they're more comfortable with or whatever they prefer the most. It's the best way to make sure everyone feels included and safe. So I guess in interacting with people today, it's really nice when you introduce yourselves and where you're from and your names, also just giving pronouns as a nice kind of equalizer. Anyway, from there, I'm a bit nervous, so if I ramble on too much, Sam will tap me on the shoulder and bring me back.
Sure, you'll be fine.
But I'm just going to talk a bit about me, and people often ask me when I realised I was bisexual or when I realised I was transgender. To be honest, it's always kind of been an innate thing. It's been there, but I didn't always have the language or the words to describe what I was feeling. And, you know, as a young person who felt a bit isolated because of that, it was quite scary. And for a long time, it was really hard because, you know, even though I had a beautiful, tight-knit and loving, warm community like the Jewish community, even within that, I still kind of felt a little bit like I was an outsider. But, you know, there were people here and there, maybe an uncle or maybe a role model who worked and did amazing community work, but no one my age, until I found amazing youth organisations like Y Gender, a trans organisation for young people, and Minus 18, an organisation for LGBTI people of all identities, aged 21 and under. The name is misleading. But that was really incredible. For the first time, I was like, oh my goodness, you know, look at these happy, inspired, incredible people, and I can be a part of that. You know, all the gloom and doom that I saw on TV and I saw in the media wasn't all there was for the first time. And I suddenly felt a lot more hopeful for what was before me. And so I began to feel more confident and feel great, but a part of me felt torn. I had this new community, but to really kind of be a part of it, I slowly felt like I was slipping away from the Jewish community. I was feeling like I was at a crossroads. I had to pick one or the other, and I couldn't have it both. And that was really hard. It was unthinkable. You know, how can I choose one amazing group of people and leave behind the other? But that tension kind of got more and more. So to be here today and to see the kind of amazing change we've had over the last few years and just incredible growth within the Jewish community, to be at a place where now I've been lucky enough to be part of the youth team that informed some of the work and to meet so many amazing Jewish adults of all different identities who've done incredible work to make today possible is so inspiring and so exciting, and I'm so grateful to all of you for making that possible and helping ensure that, you know, future generations of LGBTI Jewish young people might not, you know, have to go through that sense of, I guess, identity crisis or sense of not being sure that where they belong. They can just kind of join an incredible and inspired community that accepts people as who we are, as we should be. So yeah, at its core, I want to say thank you very much for being here tonight and making a huge difference for all of us and helping create a more inclusive world.
And similar to Margot, I've also been incredibly lucky to be involved with Y Gender and to attend Minus 18 events, and seeing those organizations that are working so hard on transgender and gender diverse inclusion and LGBTI inclusion and rights more broadly has been an incredible experience, because being genderqueer is an important and inherent part of my identity, and I do know that means that I am not the same as my straight or cisgender friends, and there is a very distinct difference for me as a trans person, as a bisexual person, that means that my needs and my experiences are going to be inherently different. And so seeing that there were these organizations that were actively and passionately working on those issues was an incredibly uplifting experience, and that while I was seeing those forms of discrimination and experiencing that kind of exclusion that is unfortunately still so present in our society, being able to work to combat those issues was really important as a way to acknowledge that we're not there yet and there's a lot that we still need to do, whilst realizing that there is a hopeful approach to this, and that being misgendered in every space isn't going to be a constant thing, and having to explain why I'm using they, them pronouns isn't going to keep happening at every single event. And I've seen amazing changes happen already. I'm involved with NETSA, one of the progressive Jewish youth movements, and just over the past few years they've made incredible strides to being a lot more trans inclusive, and have been really open to acknowledging that there is a lot of work to do, and that as primarily cisgender people there's a lot of areas that they aren't familiar with, and recognizing that trans people, particularly the trans young people who are involved with that organization, are the ones who understand our needs the best, has been really great and a really affirming experience. And I'm so glad to see so many people here willing to listen to the speeches and participate in the workshop so that we can all share our experiences.
I'm just wondering if you can just talk to the group just about, you talked about cisgender, and I'm just wondering whether the audience understand what that means, and if you could just explain.
So for anyone who's not familiar, I'm sure we've all heard the word transgender. Cisgender is a counterpart to that in the same vein as heterosexual. And although it is a bit of an emerging term for some people, not everyone's necessarily familiar with it, it's a really nice way to recognise that trans is just another way to be. Rather than saying transgender and then non-transgender, or trans and normal, it's a much nicer way to kind of be like, well, there are just different ways to be. And cisgender is just as much another way to be, if that makes sense.
I just saw a couple of confused faces when we said my identification. So when we say transgender, we're saying someone whose gender identity does not entirely match the gender that they were assigned at birth. So for me, I was assigned female at birth, meaning that the doctors and my parents and the people around me said that I was a girl, but I now identify as genderqueer or non-binary. So cisgender is someone who doesn't have an experience like that. The gender that they currently identify with is the same as the gender that they were assigned at birth.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Sally Golden, has been involved in Melbourne's queer community for the last 17 years. This includes involvement with Transgender Victoria, and now she's an executive director, presenter of 3CR's Out of the Pan, and is a member of the Committee of Bisexual Alliance Victoria. She's a life member of 4 LGBTI organisations, was awarded Activist of the Year at the 2010 Also Awards, and was noted in the Asia's Top 100 Most Creative and Influential People in Melbourne in 2011. Please welcome Sally.
Thank you, and welcome. I too would acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land on which we meet, and pay respects to elders past and present. And at a session such as this, I like to acknowledge our lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and intersex elders, including sister girls and brother boys, and acknowledge their unique contributions to diversity and intersectionality on and around our land. My stories start with once upon a time. My story tonight is actually going to do something quite unusual. It's going to start in the middle. And for someone who is coming up for 50 physical years, my story spiritually started on the 27th of April 1995, and when my soul yawned, stretched, awoke and asked for coffee, and hashtag caffeine. But I think that's a really important point, and it follows actually from something that Margot said, that even for someone who, being in Y gender, you're under 25, I'm now slightly in the middle age cohort of somewhere over 25. There's a similarity. Like yourself, I for a long time didn't have language with which to connect to my gender identity and sexual orientation as well. And so it's really important, as was touched on by Sean, to get that sense of connection. It is very, very important. So what happened on 27 April 1995 was I finally tracked down a health professional, again touched on in Sean's information. There's a logical order to all this tonight, everybody. And it was really important to find a health professional who gave a definition of trans, as it was then, transgender, that worked for me. She just said there are some males who are more feminine than masculine, some who need to be female, and that's transgender. Now, nowadays we'd have a much more fleshed out definition, but that was for me, and there was this huge light bulb that came on, and all of a sudden the past made sense. So what was it that wasn't there in my past, that I didn't have that sense of connection? So I was born in 1965, and despite the hopefully relatively slim sucks-in tummy figure that you see now, apparently by 3, according to Mum and Dad, I was eating roast dinners, and so I did end up looking like the Michelin tire person. And, well, I've still got the appetite. It's a friend of mine coined the phrase residual male programming many years ago. I think I've still kept that part. So life was like, well, reasonably okay up until 3. I was at home with my family. I went to what we would now call an all-genders kindergarten. There was a sense of connection. But at aged 4 1/4, on my first day at school, and how a nice Jewish girl ends up at an Anglican boys' school, I do know the answer to it, but I did. And jokes aside, I can look back at it now and sort of say, well, I've reconciled it. But I think that to spend 30, I remember my first day at school. I remember looking back at Mum, who was, say, roughly over there. Doran, pretend to be my mum for a minute. You don't have to, but there was about that distance. And I'm at the door here of the classroom, and I'm looking back going, I'm really scared. I didn't know why for years. You can now I relieve you of acting duties. Thanks, Doran. And the thing was, I realised I'm going into this classroom of about 20 to 25 boys. Yikes. Isolation. Sean touched on that as well. It is such a damaging thing for LGBTI people. We often think we're the only one. And I suppose, I'll hold that point just for a moment. And it wasn't a pleasant time at school. Often, as well as gender identity, parts of gender that are important are gender expression. And that's both what we'll call the outward way of how we might dress or how we might have our hair or whatever else, but it's also our sense of inward, a deeper sense of how we communicate and other things. Although I didn't have language for it, I knew there was something, a question mark. So here I am at an all-boys school where I only heard recently, the principal at that time passed away very recently, that there was a big emphasis on sport at that time. Brighton Grammar was sort of down the bottom of the Associated Public Schools League. I am not a sporting person. I'm still working to get dog walking as an Olympic sport. Not working. So I wasn't having a good time. And as per the stats, throughout years 7 and 8, I was verbally bullied by roughly the entire class of 25, and there was no real support. So it really pushed that isolation out, and part of it was because I wasn't your standard, in inverted commas, masculine male. And so it did stop at year 9, thanks to an assertive teacher, which again Sean touched on. And so really school left a very long gap. And I felt cut off from my entire soul, including spirituality and faith, for a long time. The Christianity at that school was spoken quite well, and I think did convey the message of Christianity. As much as I'm able to comment on that, it did convey a message of compassion and faith and love that I think was what it was about. And there was the occasional, yes, homophobic remark from the Reverend, but not a lot. So I went through school. Nice Jewish boy, studied accounting at university and went through that. That was the 80s. I think that was the brown pinstripe suits that were in at the time. We'll probably get past that. People have just eaten. But after working as an accountant from around 1986 to 1994 and also working for a very difficult manager, things got a bit too stressful, long story. So I spent 3 months overseas, which I think seems to be a standard story for a lot of people who have not been able to think about their sexual orientation or gender identity. And when you go away, the pressure's off and what you've been pushing down with day-to-day stress comes up. So I ended up, and I've got there, my favourite place that I went to was Nova Scotia on the east side of Canada, and had a very good time. I also went to a friend's wedding in the UK. And I think that's important to note, that sometimes it can just be trying to be taking that pressure off. So I then came back in, middle of 1994, and on New Year's Day 1995 was the first time I'd ever told anyone about my sexual orientation, my gender identity, the pictures I had in my head, as I called them, of being female. And I try to look back at the first part of my life, and sometimes, yes, there's a sense of frustration and anger, but I also think honestly that if I'd have tried to be myself at that time, the world wasn't ready for me and I wasn't ready for the world, and I wouldn't be here now. But sometimes, yes, there's a sense of frustration, and in the words of one of the great writers of our time, Don Henley, sometimes it does feel like wasted time. And that's also a blatant plug for one of my favourite bands of all time. So we get to that point again in April 1995, where suddenly I've got the sense of connection, the light bulb, everything's clear. Well, that's why I didn't quite fit in at an all-boys school. You could almost, in Homer Simpson language, say, "Dole." And so we're back to where the soul awake again with the coffee. And it kicked in at that point. Life really began to move in the right direction. I joined the group Seahorse, which only last month celebrated its 40th birthday, and I think it's very important that we have lots of groups. Margot mentioned Y-gender for young people. There's groups for trans men like FTM Shed, there's 10, and they also put on joint events now, and that's a very heartening thing to see that all the various groups in trans and gender diverse groups in Melbourne work together where there's common ground such as health pathways or employment issues. So I joined Seahorse, which was a good start, and I think it's important to realise that people's journeys are fluid over time, and for around 2.5 years I identified, to use a jargonic term, as a cross-dresser, which I define as someone who has not made a permanent affirmation of a different gender identity to what's expected at birth, but occasionally I presented as female, and I thought that's where I needed to be, but it wasn't. But there was an important thing that happened in the next 2.5 years. The next sort of layer that blew away, it was like layers of fog were blowing away. I realised that I was someone whose sexual orientation was bisexual. I'm going to define that, and as I say, as we have already said, there are no right or wrong definitions. Someone who over the course of their life is attracted to more than one gender. And there's a whole heap of definitions there. If you put bisexual umbrella in your search engine, you can come up and have a look at them. And bisexual was the term I had at the time because the person who probably saved my life before that counsellor was someone who came out to me as bisexual and was only out to about 2 other people, and that was pretty helpful. It gave some sense of connection to the rainbow type of community, and that, again, connection, we're getting a theme here. But by 1998 I realised I needed to live full-time as female. I had to be who I needed to be, and we didn't have a lot of rights at that time, but that's another story. And it was very helpful at that time, although my sexual orientation was bisexual, to connect with the Jewish lesbian group. And that was very important for affirmation of my female self. There was not a lot of support for trans people anywhere at that time, and they were quite comfortable with my gender identity, my sexual orientation. To go to the Jewish lesbians, say it was a very affirming experience for my gender identity. And I think that's important for trans and gender diverse people to find that sense of connection. It is like starting a new life at times. And so that was a very important part of perhaps beginning to reconnect to my sense of faith and spirituality. And this is something that I'm bringing in lots of pieces here because we are whole beings. Yes, we're Jewish, yes, we're any or all of GLBTI, but we're whole people with those parts that are equally as important to us. We touched on mental health. I wanted to bring this in as part of the whole person. I am someone who is recognised with the situation of cyclothymia, which is, in simple language, a smaller version of bipolar. I do have ups and downs in my mental health. I largely have it managed now. But I want to bring this in because it's important to recognise whilst GLBTI people experience discrimination in relation to who they are, we also can have other mental health situations that are separate. But I would think the discrimination probably exacerbates that cyclicality in those situations. The thing that began to turn my life around as a person, though, was in 2004. I worked with a life coach and life coaching, for anyone who's done it, it's about the journey, it's not about the goals that you set. And at around session 5, we had the big breakthrough where my coach said, "Do you mind if I give you some feedback?" And it's very good that we use consensual communication. I said, "That's okay." She said, "Do you realise you see things in a somewhat glass half empty point of view?" And the answer is that she was right, totally understandably. She helped me realise there is a glass that can be half full. And for those who are working in a health situation, a counselling or therapeutic situation, that was important that I began to work on myself as a person, and that's why I bring this in. And there are two last bits of me that are important that have perhaps nothing to do with LGBTI, but they give me the strength for who I am. A highly sensitive person, a deeply processing person, a highly empathic person, which has its pluses and minuses, and I am someone who is also an introvert, which people often have misconceptions about. And there's a lot of debate about that, but generally I get my energy from within. And I think we need to acknowledge that too. So I bring in all of that to remind us that we are the whole person. And I also want to finish with 2 points. And I'm going to go a little further than what was said before. You know, and the remark that was made for that person, "I'm gay, so what?" Yes, I'm trans and I'm bi, and I'm really happy about that now. It's been a long journey, but I'm there, and I want to go further. I feel that if we value diversity and intersectionality and value everyone for their unique strengths, we take those strengths, and I feel for me as a trans and bi person, to use a favourite hashtag binary busters, we have the ability to look beyond so much of society's assumptions about gender. And I feel, yes, we have a lot of journeys, a lot of things that still need to be sorted out legally, socially for LGBTI people. And we need to be mindful that, yes, those issues are there. But let's start finding ways that value sexual orientation, gender identity and bodily diversity. Let's utilise those for everyone's benefit. I believe we have unique gifts and insights and would like to start utilising those a lot, and would like everyone to be mindful of that as how we get past all these barriers and then shine. I think, for example, of Lana Wachowski, a co-creator of the Matrix and Cloud Atlas films. There's someone who definitely took the red pill, and I think her genius is something with which we can take some great strength from. We talked about resilience, but there's other strengths that LGBTI people have. Let's be mindful of that tonight, that yes, there are negatives to overcome, but let's get that genius out. So to finish, there was one other thing I wanted to touch on, that idea of connection. Sean mentioned lots of research. There's a piece of research from Northern Ireland called Speaking from the Margins on Transgender People. And I asked about suicidal thoughts as distinct from attempts. And the figure for trans and gender diverse people prior to being themselves of suicidal thoughts was 81%. The figure afterwards, 4%. You can be that battery cable, I call it. You can plug into someone, get them past that, get them to a point of positivity, get them charging themselves. You can help bring out their uniqueness and their gifts for everyone, including the wider society and the Jewish community as well. Shalom.
Sally. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Questions?